Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 5, Text 28. Saha Api Amsha Guna Kala Atma Bhagavat Drishti Gocharaha Atmanam Vyakarot Atma Vishvasya Asya Shrikshaya. Sopyam saguna kalatma Sopyam saguna kalatma
Sopyam saguna kalatma.
Sopyam shaguna kalatma
Sopyam shaguna kalatma.
Bhagavad drishti gocharaha
Bhagavad drishti gocharaha.
Bhagavad drishti gocharaha
Bhagavad drishti gocharaha.
Atmanam vyakarodatma Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma
Sopyam shaguna kalatma.
Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma At the bottom Vishwasyasya shushikshaya. Please repeat. Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Swasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Swasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya. Matajis. Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Sopyam shaguna kalatma Bhagavad drishti gocharaha Atmanam vyakarodatma Vishwasyasya sushikshaya Saha Mahatattva Api also Amsha Purusha plenary expansion Guna chiefly the quality of ignorance. Kala, the duration of time. Atma, full consciousness. Bhagavat, the personality of Godhead. Drishti Gojaraha, range of sight. Atmanam, many different forms. Vyakarot, differentiated. Atma, reservoir. Vishwasya, the would-be entities. Asya, of this. Shrikshaya, generates the false ego. Translation purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Thereafter, the Mahatattva differentiated itself into many different forms as the reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, and it generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. Purport. The Mahatattva is the via medium between pure spirit and material existence. It is the junction of matter and spirit, wherefrom the false ego of the living entity is generated. All living entities are differentiated parts and parcels of the personality of Godhead. Under the pressure of false ego, the conditioned souls, although parts and parcels of the supreme personality of Godhead, claim to be the enjoyers of material nature. This false ego is the binding force of material existence. The Lord again and again gives a chance to the bewildered conditioned souls to get free from this false ego. And that is why the material creation takes place at intervals. He gives the conditioned souls all facilities for rectifying the activities of the false ego, but he does not interfere with their small independence as parts and parcels of the Lord. Om Ajnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guro Shriyutah Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagar Jatam Sahagana Raghunathan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalitha Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha. He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Pura Madhumati Pranashaki Vrindavane Sthita Aduna Naraharyakyaha Sarakaraf Prabhov Priyaha. Narahari Sarkar, the Lord's dear associate, was previously Radha's intimate girlfriend named Madhupati. That's the English is a little strange. Is today Narahari Sarkar. Sri Lochan Das Thakur has written the following about his guru in Chaitanya Mangal. Narahari Das Thakur is my worshipable master. He was the descendant of a pure line of physicians. His body was permeated by love for Krishna, and he taught his disciples nothing other than Krishna Prema. He was previously known as Madhumati, one of Radha's dearest Sakhis in Vrindavan, a storehouse of sweetness. Now, in the age of Kali, with the appearance of Gauranga, he has become the keeper of the storehouse of love for Radha and Krishna. So, there's quite some bit to speak about Narahari Sarkar. There's also a nice song that he composed. Now, unfortunately, when I was preparing for class, I forgot to prepare to speak on Narahari Sarkar Thakur. So that's why I just read a little bit about him to honor his disappearance. Tomorrow's speaker could speak on Narahari Sarkar Thakur and I think it's Kaliya Krishna. And then maybe even the following day is Sri Saranga Thakur. That, if there's time, that could also get covered tomorrow. So, requesting the speaker for tomorrow to kindly make a note of that. I think it's Chandanacharya tomorrow. Hare Krishna. Sri Narahari Sarkar Thakur ki jai. So, here we are reading about the creation of the material universe, and this is a very deep science, and the science has a lot to do with our current existence, because our conditioning is unwrapped and unraveled by understanding this process of creation, which is why it comes so many times in the Bhagavatam. It's repeatedly mentioned, and Prabhupada's purports mention it so many times. Just in the Bhagavad Gita, Prabhupada speaks about Mahatattva at least, there's several times. That, from what I was looking up just today, it seemed like, the Mahatattva is being explained at least about 5-6 times in the Bhagavad Gita. And now, here it's described that the Mahatattva differentiated itself into many different forms as the reservoir of the would-be entities. The Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, generates the false ego. It is a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead with full consciousness of creative principles and time for fructification. So, how do you understand here that the Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, but it's also a plenary expansion of the personality of Godhead? How do you kind of consolidate this? It's because it is like the Supreme Personality of Godhead is creating the circumstance that is leading to our conditioning here in this material world. And that is what we have to understand. Just like we say, all living entities are servants of Krishna. They are ultimately Satchidananda. But then we also say the living entities in the material world are in the mode of ignorance. They are conditioned. So here the Supreme Personality of Godhead is creating that circumstance. Therefore, in the previous verse, to make it very clear that Supreme Personality of Godhead is not in ignorance, you have the verse that's, I thought it was casting on the screen. Something happened. Okay. So, it says here that in this Mahatattva, the unalloyed goodness, the Supreme Lord, sowed the seeds of universal manifestation out of his own body. So Supreme Personality of Godhead is pure goodness. Then Srila Prabhupada in the purport says, the Mahatattva or shadow of pure consciousness is the germinating place for all creation. It is pure goodness with a slight addition of the material mode of passion, and therefore activity is generated from this point. It's quite interesting. You have pure goodness, then in the purport you have pure goodness mixed with passion, and literally in the next verse you have Mahatattva is chiefly in the mode of ignorance and is plenary portion of Supreme Personality of Godhead. So it takes a little digging to kind of understand, but it makes complete sense. So to bring up a reference here, in Canto 2, Chapter 1, Text 35. The principle of matter, Mahatattva, is the consciousness of the omnipresent Lord as asserted by the experts, and Rudradev is his ego. The horse, mule, camel, elephant are his nails, and wild animals and quadrupeds are situated in the belt zone of the Lord. So this is description of the Virata Rupa. And here it's described that the consciousness of the Supreme Lord is the Mahatattva, and Rudradev is his ego. So here also in the purport that we are discussing, that we are seeing here that you have the Mahatattva, which is chiefly in the mode of ignorance, and it generates the false ego. Now, a couple of verses back, we saw how Mahatattva is also described as the consciousness of the Supreme Lord, and that we just read right now. So, what do you understand from this? So, the point is, Mahatattva is material energy that has become activated. Okay, you have Krishna has three energies, primarily constituted of three energies. You have internal energy, marginal energy, and external energy. Okay, internal energy is always active. Therefore, in a couple of verses before, we see here, let's see. Yes, in text 24, the verse says, the material energy was dormant, whereas the internal potency was manifested. So the difference between the internal and external potencies is that one is always manifest, whereas the other one manifests and unmanifests. So when the unmanifested material energy of the Lord becomes manifest, it is called Mahat Tattva. Okay? And actually, we will read later in a purport that this Mahat Tattva is a portion of material energy. But it is the manifested material energy. Okay? And a portion of that Mahat Tattva becomes false ego. So, Krishna activates his external energy. How does he activate it? He activates that external energy by glancing. Now this external energy is Durga, is Maya, is actually a consort of the Supreme Lord. Now, of course, it's also described that she is the shadow. What shadow? She's shadow actually of Yoga Maya. And therefore, when this material energy becomes activated, now it becomes activated, but still for anything to happen, Supreme Lord has to enter. So therefore, Supreme Lord expands himself as a plenary portion and enters into the Mahat Tattva. Prabhupada describes this in his purports to Bhagavad Gita. Because we are having shorter classes, I'm not going to go over all the purports. But Prabhupada describes that even the Mahat Tattva, even matter, material energy, cannot activate itself unless the Supreme Personality of Godhead enters it. So yes, he's impregnating the living entities, but still he himself has to enter it. How do you understand this? For instance, Supreme Lord is creating all the different universes, as we see from that painting there. It's coming in the form of bubbles, coming out of the pores of his skin and through his breathing, Mahavishnu. But still, the universes don't have any activity unless Supreme Lord himself enters. So, Supreme Lord has to be present in every single instance. Even when the living entity is there, Supreme Lord has to be present. Like we have our bodies. The body is activated by the presence of the soul. That's the difference between a living body and a dead body. But still the Paramatma is required. If the Paramatma is not there, this body will not act. Because the living entities themselves cannot activate matter. Supreme Personality of Godhead has to be there to activate matter because it is his energy. Now, this is not required in the case of Yoga Maya. In the spiritual world, there is no Paramatma. Because, why? Because Yoga Maya is always manifest. She is not unmanifest and manifest. But the nature of external energy is that she is manifest and unmanifest. So, when she has to become a manifest state, Supreme Lord has to enter. When Supreme Lord leaves, immediately unmanifest. We see that with our own bodies. When the living entity leaves, Paramatma leaves with it. Immediately body loses its ability to function the way it functions. It disintegrates into what is the external surroundings. Either turns into, as it's described, the body turns into three types. You can turn into stool, it can turn into ash, or it can turn into dirt. It just turns into soil. So, similarly, the point here is that matter itself cannot act without the presence of the Supreme Lord. Again, what has this directly got to do with our existence? In the conditioned life, we are looking at so many objects. We are looking at so many things we want to do in this material world. The conditioned living entities want to build houses, build skyscrapers, want to establish empires, control material nature, manufacture so many things. But ultimately, nothing will happen if the Supreme Personality of Godhead does not sanction it. Now, of course, Supreme Personality of Godhead is present in every atom. But we can understand that when the Supreme Lord, along with the living entity, leaves this body, it turns into what is the exterior. Like right now, whatever we have around here, also Supreme Lord is present. But it is his desire that the matter is present in that form. Whereas when the living entity is present, it is Supreme Lord's desire that the matter forms in this shape. according to the qualifications of the living entity. So depending on the qualifications of the living entity, sometimes the living entity gets the body of a hog, sometimes gets the body of a plant, sometimes a fish, sometimes a human being, sometimes a demigod. But it all happens with the Supreme Lord being present there. Matter takes these forms and shapes. So, now, after the Supreme Lord himself enters, right, over here it said that in this Mahatattva, the unalloyed goodness, Supreme Lord, sowed the seeds of universal manifestation out of his own body. So, when Supreme Lord enters Mahatattva, Mahatattva becomes activated, but he also has some passion. What is that passion? Because that passion causes creation. He exhibits some passion. And that passion is required for the different forms, which is the reservoir of the would-be living entities. So what are these forms? The Supreme Lord in the Mahatattva literally creates the prototype of everything in this universe. That we find in this universe, prototype is created. And then when the Supreme Lord enters each and every universe, Brahma meditates on the Supreme Lord, gets impregnated with the intelligence of all the prototypes that the Supreme Lord has already created in the Mahatattva, and seeing that, Brahma creates the entire universe. And the living entities go in there. So, the point here that Supreme Lord is teaching us by his pastime here is that to create anything, you require little passion. And all these material forms, any material form that we need to create, it requires passion. And so, and how do you know that? Especially in the activity of sex. That when there is a little passion, then sex happens. And from sex comes a form. The baby comes out as a form. So similarly, Supreme Lord enters into the Mahatattva with the mode of passion and the living entities and creates forms for those living entities. Now, what is that false ego? So once the forms are created, when the living entity looks at those forms, he generates false ego. Okay, false ego is generated because you have matter which is now in the form of different things, as we see, different forms, many forms. And living entity is spirit. As Srila Prabhupada writes here, the Mahatattva is the via medium between the pure spirit and material existence. It is the junction of matter and spirit wherefrom false ego of the living entity is generated. So then what is this ignorance? The ignorance is the consciousness. When the living entity has forgotten that he is a servant of Krishna and he is looking at matter, false ego gets generated. So, Krishna Buli Sei Jeev Anadir Bahir Mukha Ateva Maya Tare Deha Samsara Dhuka. And then what is that other verse? Actually, this is not the verse I wanted to go. Krishna Bahir Mukha Bhogavancha Kare. So when the living entity turns his face, that means he has forgotten ignorance. And that ignorance is the predominating consciousness of Mahatattva. It is that consciousness. And why is it the consciousness of the Supreme Lord? It's not Supreme Lord consciousness, meaning Supreme Lord is carrying the desire of the living entities to enjoy separately from him. And that consciousness becomes manifest as Mahatattva because the living entities cannot enjoy separately from Krishna in the internal potency. Therefore, Supreme Lord activates the external potency with the consciousness that the living entities have, which they have chosen due to their independent spirit. That they have chosen that consciousness because they have minute independence and Because of that independence, so Prabhupada writes, he gives the conditioned soul all facilities. So Supreme Lord is giving all facilities here. Now, why is matter by nature manifest and unmanifest? This is amazing thing. Why is this world not eternal? Srila Prabhupada gives the explanation here that the Lord again and again gives a chance. So, the Lord again and again gives a chance to the bewildered conditioned souls to get free from this false ego, and that is why material creation takes place in intervals. If this material creation was eternal, eternally manifest, we would remain eternally conditioned. But Supreme Lord, okay, He doesn't want to interfere with our independence, but still He has to give us a chance to go back home, back to Godhead. How is He going to do this? How is Supreme Lord going to do this? Supreme Lord is supremely intelligent. He is the most smart. He is the most clever. And He comes up with this amazing idea. Well, they can enjoy, but if it's temporary, then they can't enjoy eternally. Then they always have a chance to come back to me. So this is how Supreme Lord has come up with this amazing idea. Otherwise our conditioning would be eternal. Our conditioning would be eternal. The material existence would be eternal. Our false ego would remain eternal. But it's not eternal. It's not eternal because everything in material nature, because the false ego is because everything comes from the Mahat Tattva. And if the Mahat Tattva itself by nature is dormant and activated and then dormant, therefore our conditioning also can become dormant or it can become activated. And therefore it gives us the chance to escape. So this is very amazing point that Srila Prabhupada is making here and explaining why there has to be creation and destruction. No other philosophy in this world can explain this reason. Why does there have to be creation and destruction? Absolutely nothing can explain why Supreme Lord creates and destroys. Is He crazy? He's just creating something, destroying something, creating something, destroying something. Why would you, even we, like say somebody starts, a car manufacturing company. Does he create it just to destroy it? Create, run it for some time, destroy it. Even when everything is running good, destroy it. So, if a conditioned living entity who is actually in his pure state is a servant of Krishna, Satchidananda, which means he exhibits the same qualities as that of Krishna, not quantitatively but qualitatively, he exhibits the same characteristics of Krishna. If the conditioned living entity in this universe doesn't create something in order to simply destroy it later without any reason, there may be reason. Sometimes you erect a temporary structure for some festival. You have for instance, for marriages, people erect all kinds of pavilions and things like this, whatever, and then later they pull it all down, destroy it. It served its purpose, but there is a purpose. Can any philosophy or religion in this world explain the purpose of why the Supreme Lord creates and destroys? Nothing. But here we have, in the Srimad Bhagavatam we have, therefore this is science of Krishna consciousness. It is the science of Godhead. Only Srimad Bhagavatam will give us this. No, you cannot understand this anywhere else. What is that? Bhutva bhutva praliyate. Ratri agame vashav partha. Prabhavatya haragame. How does it begin? Bhutagramas evayam. Bhutva bhutva praliyate. Ratri agame vashav partha. Prabhavatya haragame. And you read that verse, it's like, wow. It's like, Bhutagramas evayam. Bhutva bhutva praliyate. That, when night arises for Brahma, everything is destroyed. Again when day arises, everything is created. And again when night comes, everything is destroyed. And the conditioned living entities are helpless. The word that's used in that translation is helplessly wound up. The entire creation of the living entities are helpless in this condition. And you look at this like, what kind of person is this? Why is he doing this? Why is he doing this? And the conditioned living entity cannot understand. Oh God, why don't you allow me to be healthy always? Why do I have to get disease? Why do I have to die? Why do I have to leave my family? Why do I have to? And whole religions come up with all philosophies. With the whole idea is that when you go back to heaven, you have your uncle, you have your aunt, you have your grandmother, you have whatever they want, and that's when Jesus comes. Everybody comes back. They cannot think. It's to them. It would become unreasonable for them to think, why would God create all of this? All my my husband, my wife, my children, my home, my dog, my all of this. I want all of this with Jesus in heaven. Why would this? That's not God. They cannot understand. And if they think a little deeper, they become bewildered. They don't want to think deeper. They come up. They say, I don't want to understand this philosophy. But if we understand this, then we understand why Supreme Lord is doing this creation, destruction. And why do we have to understand this? Because in our lives, we have this conditioning. We want our material existence to stay exactly the same way it has to be. We don't like change. We don't, when something, it's upsetting. It's upsetting when suddenly your body out of nowhere gives you a toothache. It's like, why does this have to happen now? It's like, but it's there to remind us that actually, never at any point of time should the conditioned living entity ever desire that material existence should be eternal. That the only constitutional position we should have is that we should want to serve Krishna as his eternal servant. And when the living entity becomes completely pure of all material desires, then he can go to the realm of Yoga Maya, where everything is constantly manifest. There the living entity does not have to face the painful creation and destruction of this material universe. But in the conditioned state, the living entity is actually desiring something that is terrible for it. It is like basically desiring to be eternally unhappy. And the Supreme Lord doesn't allow that. He allows it. It's so amazing. His creation is as if it makes it feel eternal. Just in our life, we all know we're going to live for a mere whatever, 60, 70, 80, maybe, if we're lucky, 80 years. But this life, when we go through day to day, it feels like eternal. We plan so many things, this, that. We don't worry about death. Civilizations, every civilization knows that there were civilizations that got destroyed in the past. But they don't think like that when they plan. They talk as if their country is going to exist all the time. That is amazing ability of Supreme Lord to fulfill our desire to enjoy so-called eternal material existence, but actually not allowing us to have eternal material existence. So, all this can be understood, and when we understand this, actually it becomes very blissful. It's a source of great bliss. And in this way, we can come out of material existence by understanding these topics. Otherwise, you look at Mahatattva, it's like, because you don't really understand what Mahatattva is. It becomes confusing, like I said, literally in 2 verses, you have goodness, passion and ignorance all put together referring to the same thing. There's so much more that can be said in this regard, but it's 8:22, so I'm going to stop here. If there are any questions or comments, please feel free to ask.
Hare Krishna. This point you were making about eternally conditioned. So in the Uddhava Gita, it's mentioned. I think Uddhava asked Krishna, "Who actually enjoys matter? Is it the spirit soul? Is it matter itself?" And then Krishna says it's actually the false ego. The spirit soul can actually enjoy matter.
Yeah.
You're right. So this point of being like eternally conditioned, it doesn't actually seem that the spirit soul can actually be eternally conditioned.
No, it cannot
because
be.
It's pure. It can't
Correct.
actually be. So is it that it's actually the false ego that's actually eternally conditioned? It's not really because this.
No, nothing is eternally conditioned, because the false ego also,
Right.
it gets destroyed at the time of destruction. At the time of complete universe and annihilation, even the false ego of the living entities are destroyed, then how is it recreated back, and how does the living entity get that same false ego that it had? Because Supreme Lord remembers everything. This is what our acharyas say. That the living entities are put into slumber when the Supreme Lord has wound up his creation in the form of Yoga Nidra. And for him it's just one breath. So it's very easy for him to remember.
But like, so this term nitya like, what does that actually pertain to? Because the soul seems like it's always nitya siddha. The soul is always liberated, it's always pure. So what is this term nitya even?
Nitya Bada, as acharyas also explain, it is nitya because it seems like it is eternal.
It's not really.
But it's not really eternal. It's not really eternal. Prabhupada explains that. Yes, Prabhu.
Earlier in class, she mentioned like once like the form is there, then Krishna like glances at them, then like the false ego is generated in them, etc.
No, not Krishna, the living entity.
Oh, the living entity. Okay, so is it like before like they enter that form?
No. So they enter the Mahatattva. Krishna impregnates the Mahatattva and also enters it. So he sends the living entities into the Mahatattva, but he also enters into it. And everything is happening pretty quickly because he glances at the Mahatattva. Mahatattva becomes activated. The universes are emanating from the pores of the Supreme Lord's body. He impregnates the living entities, and he himself enters into the universes also. And Brahma is created. This is all happening in such, from the Supreme Lord's perspective, it's all happening quickly. But from our perspective, it's taking a really long time. Therefore, it's kala choditat. It's happening when the time is ready. But Supreme Lord's time is just one breath, in and out. So, what's happening is, Supreme Lord is entering into the Mahatattva, and living entities are also entering into it. Forms are created by the Supreme Lord, and the living entities look at those forms, or matter, basically, and become conditioned. And the false ego is generated. And this false ego causes them to become conditioned.
Okay.
Yes.
So you're saying how the Supreme Lord, his glance, is that when he glances, it creates the external energy?
Not creates, activates.
Activates.
The Supreme Lord, external energy is eternal. Okay? She's always there. She's energy of the Supreme Lord. All the energies of the Supreme Lord are eternal. But one of the energies is manifest and unmanifest. It's dormant and active. Dormant and active. That's the external energy.
Okay, so active is the
So it's
Mahatattva, right?
the external energy is already there. Now she is, in one sense, because she's energy of the Lord, she's one with the Lord. But she's always there. When the Supreme Lord glances at her, she becomes activated. I wanted to explain that impregnation and glancing, but there's not enough time.
What's the meaning of inactivated? What's the meaning of inactivated?
Dormant state. Means forms are not there. The modes of material nature are not manifest. The different universes are not manifest. It's just external energy. It's just energy.
Again, Mahatattva is the activated.
Is the activated. And the unactivated is sometimes called as Pradhana. Pradhana and Mahatattva are basically the same thing. One is activated, the other is unactivated. Yeah, I have to give others. Let's also go to the side of the Matajis.
Prabhu, I'm just wondering, at what point in time will the false ego always affect the practitioner? Because we hear how even up into the stages of like bhava and prema, there's traces of impurities. And I was listening to Brigapati Prabhu yesterday. He was saying you can perform acts of devotional service and you can feel your false ego like dripping off, like wearing away. So I was wondering, is the false ego always going to be affecting us? Or?
No, the false ego won't affect us when we become impregnated with spiritual knowledge. And spiritual knowledge is in two forms, jnana and vijnana. So jnana is knowledge, vijnana is realized knowledge. And when one has realized knowledge, then one is actually acting on that knowledge that one has received. then what happens is the consciousness of the living entity is no longer in ignorance, and therefore when he looks at matter, the false ego doesn't generate. This is the whole science that's being described here. We're understanding the process of creation in order to learn how to reverse it. So therefore there is knowledge that I am spirit soul, I am servant of Krishna, and then there's realized knowledge that I am spirit soul, servant of Krishna. Both are required. Actually, vijnana cannot happen without jnana, but jnana in its by itself is not jnana by itself will not give proper action. So, therefore, jnana vijnana astikyam brahma karma svabhavajam. That's brahmana supposed to be. Have jnana and vijnana. Okay, Matajis, anything? No. Charandeep raised his hand.
Prabhu, you were saying Mahatattva is the consciousness of the Supreme Lord?
Yes.
Can you explain that a little more? How is...
So like I said, Supreme Lord in his plenary expansion, when he enters into the Mahatattva, exhibits the consciousness of the consciousness which is ignorance of his supreme identity. The Mahatattva is the ignorance. It's ignorance. What is it ignorance of? It's ignorance of Supreme Lord's position. Now, again, but Supreme Lord himself is pure goodness. He doesn't get infected by it. So, but out of a desire to facilitate the living entities, the Supreme Lord manifests the consciousness of Mahatattva, which conditions the living entities.
So exhibits like the prototypes of all the different forms, but also the prototype of that consciousness.
No, the consciousness is what creates those forms. The consciousness mixed with a little... So the consciousness is from where all those forms are created. Okay? Supreme Lord is pure goodness mixed with a little passion. And when there is material consciousness, conditioning happens. Supreme Lord is conscious of his own material energy. For him it is not ignorance, but for us it is. For him it's just his energy. But for us what happens is it generates that false ego. It's actually, the entire process is super inconceivable. But try to understand. Basically, when we say Mahatattva is consciousness, it is called material consciousness. So, that's what it is. Yeah. Okay. Hare Krishna. It's 8:31. It's too late. Alright. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Vancha kalpatarubhyascha, kripa sindhubhyev cha, patitanam pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.